Welcome to Ray's Found in Translation radio show and podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Found in Translation is the talk show where we discuss politics and latest news headlines from a diverse perspective. This is your host, Ray Collazo. You can find the Translation radio show and podcast anywhere you can download a podcast: iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, Pandora. It's not music, but it's something you have to stream in your ears every week when we download the episodes. And of course, for our radio listeners, you can check us out, the radio version of the show. You can check out at WPPMLP Philadelphia 106.5 FM, which you can also check out on the TuneIn app. This is Jose Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, this is a sort of a bonus episode of the podcast because, let me set the stage for you. It's Monday evening, I believe July 22nd. The family's in bed. That's how late it is, and I have to get on a flight tomorrow morning to go to Las Vegas to collaborate with some of our leaders out there on an economic forum we're putting together on Wednesday. So if you're in Las Vegas, look out for me. We're having an event with some great leaders out there, which we'll talk about later in the week on the show. But I had to get on this mic. I'm tired. I haven't even finished packing, but I had to share, on behalf of the Puerto Rican nation, kind of where I'm at, where we're at in this moment of history. And obviously, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about where we go from here, my political analysis of what will take place, what we need to do as a community. But I wanted to talk about this context first in a historic perspective. And so some people may be wondering, wow, this seems like quite a reaction. Now we're talking, if you didn't pay much attention today or the last several days of the news, or you don't have a lot of friends on Facebook, Puerto Rican friends on Facebook, you may not realize, but we have a true revolutionary moment when it comes to peaceful civil unrest happening, not only on the island of Puerto Rico, but throughout the diaspora, throughout the world. There are Puerto Ricans protesting, convening, literally all over the world. I just watched a video. There's a group of Puerto Rican activists in San Francisco who have been convening off and on for the last several days. What appears to be kind of the main square in San Francisco. It's unbelievable, coast to coast. And of course, the main hub of this activity being San Juan, where, hundreds of thousands, who knows how many, marched and are continuing to protest throughout the day. And in the evening, there was a group of motorcyclists that were now going to head to the Fortaleza to keep the pressure on. And so I think about, this really is a crescendo of, some could argue, over 500 years of colonialism that has led to this, and this colonial mentality that many of our leaders through all political stripes on the island have maintained. And even to some degree, you could argue throughout the diaspora, this colonial mentality has led to this frustration by the Puerto Rican people of not having true self-determination on an individual level and on a level of our community. Because, as I've often shared on the show, two-thirds of the job, two-thirds of the separation of our community has already been done. Two-thirds of us don't live on the island anymore, and many of which voted for our feet, or many of which had circumstances dealing with us being moved around for various labor needs over the last 100 plus years. And so I think about these moments of history. Of course, the Europeans arriving on the island when it was the island of Borinquen in 1492. And that started a fundamental change in the demographics of the island, which led to the extermination largely of our Taino, Arawak indigenous peoples, even though the culture and the blood is la sangre de la nación taína is still well within us. And if you look at many of us, you can see that it's still there in our face in the mirror every day. Thank God. We then fast forward to the mid-19th century. El Grito de Lares, sort of the most highly recognized revolutionary revolt moment on the island. 1898, the colony is traded and exchanged in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War from the country of Spain to the country of the United States. And that Over the next century, the beginning of the formalization of that colonial status takes place. 1917, Puerto Ricans become U.S. citizens, regardless of where they're born. Under the leadership of then Governor Luis Muñoz Marin, the country ratifies essentially our Commonwealth status, which is the status we currently have today. Then, of course, probably the biggest moment in history over the last certainly 75 years was Hurricane Maria 2 years ago, which exposed the sin of colonialism and the remnants of it, and the shameful response not only of the U.S. government by this racist administration, but now as we find out more and more, it's clear by local leadership that had that colonial mentality. And I'll talk more about how Rossello showed himself to truly exemplify that by his decisions today over the last few days. And again, there's yours, Ray Collazo, on the Found in Translation podcast talking about Puerto Rico when I should be asleep because I have to fly out in about 9 hours. So where do we go from here? I will say this, that thinking about kind of what the last 5 or 6 days has wrought, first of all, it's been an incredible source of pride in being Puerto Rican. Even in my lowest moments of despair as it relates to where a community would lead, whether it's on the island or our diaspora here, which has had a lot of challenges in being resettled into the mainland United States, particularly our lower income sort of multi-generational poor communities in urban America that have had, many of which have had remained in that cycle of poverty. I always believed what we're seeing now and what we really saw post Maria for the last few years, and has become what I always saw, which was just a wonderful group of people that had the values and the talents and the ethics to do great things and to contribute so much to the island and to the larger country of the United States. And as we see, particularly in the creative class and artistic class, truly people that move people around the world. So the Amparo today on the island really signified everything that I already knew and that we're sharing with the world. That spirit, that resiliency, the creativity. My goodness, I mean, we are by far, hands down, have proven Puerto Ricans are the best protesters out there. I mean, flotillas, yoga, bicycling, horse brigades. We know how to get it in and make our voice heard. And so all this history, all this pageantry, all this unity, where does it lead? I think it leads eventually Rossello having to step down. I was, then Marie Zapata, one of our leaders in Orlando, sent me a link. They will be, there are now calls to sort of create hands across the island, across certain strategic points, basically to shut down the island's highway system in the coming days. It's unclear from this page to me, maybe because my Spanish reading skills isn't the best, when this is happening, but it's going to be happening very soon. And so this is going to continue to happen. And so I think we will eventually see Rossello go. That's only the first step, though, because then we have to turn our attention to not only what leadership in this colonial government remains, the people that really run the island day to day at this point, particularly the financial situation, the Junta, the Promesa board, which is really the 800-pound gorilla in this conversation. And then what's next for our political system? Can the current party structure on the island remain? I'll find that very interesting, and I think to truly have the cleanse that we need, I find that doubtful. But we ain't playing around, people. And I think it's noteworthy to say what Puerto Ricans have shown the country and the leadership we've shown at this moment, Puerto Ricans fundamentally are responding to the challenge and combating the forces that would do harm to our community with the necessary force that is required. See, part of the problem with what's currently happening in the United States political system is that our leadership, the leadership that really understands what's happening, understands that we have a president that is really trying to become a dictator and through oppression of his dissenters and using race to manipulate and other issues of division, but primarily race, is that the people that should be leading the resistance, the Democratic Party, the progressive movement, the leadership in Congress that have the most power to do something about it, relatively speaking, are pacified because they are not truly responding to the crisis at hand. And that's fundamentally the issue. Why should we be debating this point if he should be impeached? Why should we ever be complicit, whether it's funding additional border security without strings attached, whether it's sort of allowing the judges to be these radical right-wing judges to be confirmed through the Senate, breezing through at a record pace? Why should we allow any of it? Why should we allow the normal business to take place when children are being tortured, some of which a handful have died, children and adults are being tortured unnecessarily on our southern border, many of which, if not the vast majority of which, have attempted to enter the United States through a legal process of applying for asylum. Our community is debunking the national trend, holding our leadership accountable, going past traditional political party ideology and identification to stand up and fundamentally do the right thing. And even beyond anything else, just do the right thing and have this governor, his cronyism, which represents multi-generations, multiple decades of crony corruption from many sides, political sides, to begin this purging of the colonial mentality that has ruled the island for too long. So Puerto Ricans are showing the rest of the country how we need to act. Sean King, the celebrated civil rights journalist and activist, said as much on his Instagram today. So understand the junta's next. Understand this is just the beginning of the purge. And the Puerto Rican community, I believe, is up for the challenge. My God, I'm so proud of us. Grand Central Station, the multiple rallies throughout the island, engaging multi-generations, multi-cultures, various political ideologies. There's a space for the religious community. There's a space for English-speaking Puerto Ricans like me. There's a space for the artistic class. There's a space for young people. There's a space for, I'm so proud of us. It's amazing. You know, the other thing I'd like to say on the political stuff of the island, and this may sound a little crazy, but at this point, we have to think outside the box. And maybe I'll be the first to say it. I think Ricky Martin should run for governor. And I know Ricky, I have no idea what Ricky's thinking, or he would entertain this idea. Obviously, Ricky Martin running for governor would be a tremendous pay cut from the life that he has and the work that he does. But I really think he should run because, and I don't think he would run because I don't think he'd want to step on Carmen Yulin's toes. But I think the reality is, and I personally like Carmen Yulin a lot, the mayor of San Juan, who would be potentially a favorite to be the next governor, particularly if Ricky Rossello doesn't run. But Carmen is a polarizing figure on the island, and I'm not saying it's fair, but the reality is she is. She doesn't poll particularly well. I don't think people would see her as a consensus candidate to move us forward, even though many of us are quite fond of her, particularly in the States. She's much more popular with the Puerto Rican and Latino community in the United States, in the mainland, than she is on the island. But nevertheless, I think Ricky Martin is sort of in a unique position to bring us all together right now. And he has the intelligence and the ethics. He certainly needs the money to fuck around, to do the right thing. And I just think when I think of who the next governor should be, he's the one that keeps popping in my head. So I'm going to put it out there. I had an interesting Facebook a chat with Wanda Mora, one of our local activists here in the Philadelphia area, about this conversation, and she agreed with me. That's something that should be considered. So I'm going to put it out there, sort of as a political pundit, as a potential next step, because that's going to be critical. How we handle the next election cycle, and I'm sure there'll be other, sort of outside the box candidates. Alexandra Lugaro, and who made, I think she almost got 10% the last time, sort of a true independent, unaffiliated candidate, very charismatic woman. But there's obviously a lot of leaders that'll be jockeying for position. And there's like vultures circling around Rossello's Ricky's grave right now. But obviamente, Ricky necesita a renunciar. He's gotta go. Last thing I'll say is another touch point in this whole conversation was today. Well, really over the last 24 hours, where in 24 hours he went and did a Facebook Live where he said he wasn't going to resign. He would step down. He wouldn't run again, and he would step down to be the titular head of the PNP party, his political party on the island. But he's a Democrat. He's a registered Democrat, by the way. But would not resign, and so that sort of spurred on una falta de respeto, a sense, and even more animo to come out. And many people that were interviewed in the streets said, I wasn't going to come out, but then last night he really, stuck the dagger deeper. So we had to come make some noise and hear and let him know that wasn't acceptable. And then one of the women that got interviewed said, "We're not playing around. This is not a negotiation." I love it. But then he proceeds to not listen to the Puerto Rican people, not speak to the Puerto Rican people in any real, authentic way, not listen to the Puerto Rican people, refuse interviews, refuse to really engage in this conversation with his own community. But he goes on Fox, of all places, the one mainstream outlet he goes to in the United States in English, is Fox News. And he makes a total ass of himself. He's not prepared. He lets Fox News embarrass him, humiliate him in the Puerto Rican community on this network of white supremacy. So that, to me, and we had this conversation, and there's so many Facebook chats that I'm involved in with this. My homie, Philly activist Rafael Alvarez, who I got into this conversation with on Facebook a few hours ago, basically stating, this to me epitomizes the colonial mentality. You would rather subject yourself to the humiliation of the colonizer in the white nationalist wing and channel that's fomenting this hatred against people of color and the emergence of presence of people of color in the United States. You'd rather subject yourself to be humiliated on their network, unprepared to answer basic questions about how you're going to address the call of the Puerto Rican community and the Puerto Rican nation throughout the world to have you resign. But you won't talk to your own people. You won't listen to your own people. You won't even allow yourself to be interviewed by a Puerto Rican journalist. That, to me, is the colonial mentality. And that is the mentality that we have to scrub out of our brains. We have to scrub out of regardless of the status issue, which is going to take some time to resolve. This is the beginning of that process, or the continuation post-Maria of that process, where we organized ourselves. We came together, particularly the diaspora, and we're going to continue to support the island and truly act as one. The more we act as one, we'll figure the status question out. So that, to me, is one thing I wanted to note. And the other thing is that, kind of taking this outside a little slant off the politics for a second of it, is that it's just amazing from a cultural perspective about how culture is merging into this, almost this kind of Puerto Rican culture 2.0. And what I'm saying is that, first of all, again, so many elements of our community have come together in such a unique way. And you guys, particularly the non-Puerto Ricans, you're seeing the celebrity class involved in, and that's amazing. And then one of the things is that, and I tried to play it at the beginning of this, this episode was a little bit of the diss track of Rossello that Residente de Calle 13, formerly of the Calle 13, and Bad Bunny, the uber Latin trap artist of our time, put together that really was fundamentally a hardcore, like traditional hip hop beat track. Wasn't a reggaeton song, one Latin trap song. You're seeing a lot of our people in the streets of Puerto Rico in particular expressing themselves through hip hop, expressing themselves soñando, expressing themselves through bomba plena, which was slave resistance music, expressing themselves, the idioma, expressing themselves through yoga, through prayer. I mean, you see people going up every day, the protesters, and the first thing they do is go pray for the police officers. Expressing themselves through intellectual thought, through exercise, through creativity, through everything that makes us who we are. And it's just the manifestation of all of this talent and all this creativity and all this brain power is truly special to watch. When I went to the DC march, I don't know, I guess that was winter of 2018. I commented to my brother Michael Collazo and our good friend in DC, Javier Cuevas. I think Jonathan Marrero was there too. And I said, you know what? There was about 10,000 people at this march. And I said, I can feel, you can always feel like the rhythm, right? Latinos, Puerto Ricans, people call it, I can feel the rhythm, I can feel the music, I can feel the vibe. But this was something different. This was like, there was an intellectual energy, a mental power that was harnessed in that moment. You could feel it. We always get credit for our singing, our dancing, and I love it. I love the culture. I love everything about that part of who we are. But I think, and that's frankly part of what I try to bring to the table with my guests and my contribution to Found in Translation. Because we have to bring our intellectual heft that we maintain to the table and let people know we ain't playing around, and we're not going to play around in our leadership. Because I know the capability that we have. I mean, I just saw this video, our great friend Tina Pasion Zayas in Chicago and her team. I mean, that woman could be president of the United States. I mean, how she's educating her community and connecting the dots between colonialism and the current state that we are in. This didn't start yesterday. This didn't even start 2 years ago. This didn't start 20 years ago. This started 500, doing the math in my head, 27 years ago. And the boiling point is taking place today. History in the making. We continue to live history, and we continue to need to be the leaders, the leadership, and the moment we've been waiting for. We all have to do more. We have to do our part. And I commend all of my friends and all of my family and all of my nation throughout the island, throughout the diaspora, for all that they're doing. And you're listening to the Found in Translation podcast. This is your host, Ray Collazo. You can catch the Found in Translation podcast anywhere you can download the podcast. It's on the Ray's Latino Talk podcast feed. So if you type Ray's Latino Talk on iTunes or Spotify, anywhere you download podcasts, you'll check us out. And you'll see Ray's podcast everywhere on social media. Again, we're in the transformation. I do this when I can. So we're in the process of getting the logo together so we can kind of roll out the Found in Translation branding. And I'm actually going to tag on this episode the last 20 minutes or so of last week's episode, where we primarily focused on Puerto Rico. We interviewed Nicole Acevedo from NBC News, who's chronicling what's going on the island. Really fascinating. I would encourage people to continue to if you haven't listened to that episode that we posted last week, check it out. Really got into a deep dive about what's going on the island, the history. We had some people like Jason Ortiz, Madeline Villanueva, activists. Jason is actually on the island, was on the island. Was involved in some of the protests, so gave us some real on the ground feedback, what's happening out there. And so I encourage people to listen to it. But the second half, which I thought was very important, or the last third of the show, really got into what President Trump's demonization of four women of color who happen to be U.S. Congresswomen, Congresspeople, means to our politics, and to our communities. And so we take a little bit of a deeper dive there. We also get into some talking about the field, the 2020 Democratic debate field, which actually, as we were doing the show last week, the draw came out. So there's 2 sets of 10. As I mentioned on social media, I think we'll be doing special episodes the nights after both debate nights in a few weeks. But, I think Beto O'Rourke continues to be short-shifted. He's going to be with the nerds, the progressive intellectuals like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I just don't see a path for him to shine in that configuration. The optics of Biden being literally and figuratively surrounded by 5 candidates of color is going to be fascinating. And I think the visual is going to be very symbolic. And we'll see, does Kamala like the opportunity to get another shot at him? Probably. Does Booker gets his shot? I predict Castro will continue to do well. We'll see how that plays out. It really isn't giving him much of a bump gave him a lot of credit, but it hasn't resulted in much, maybe some money, but not much in polling a bump. So we'll see. But I would just say this as it relates to the squad is that I think, again, I think the people of Puerto Rico have set the example. We have to match the fight that we're in. And the fight next year is not going to be about healthcare policy or the direction of our how do we revise our economy for this century and green jobs and all the things it should be about. How do we get every child in this country to learn coding and be ready for the next era of workforce and work that'll be available? It's not going to be about that. It's going to be about this fight for not only our democracy, but do we want to be South Africa or we want to continue to be kind of a normal, relatively boring democracy? And that's really where we're at. And we have to message. We have to be candid. We have to be bold. We have to be straight up. We have to be combative and really call out what this moment is about. And so if we continue to try to triangulate and tiptoe around this whole conversation, Trump will win again because people will see his idiocy and his stupidity and his braggadociousness and his narcissism on some odd level of strength. And they'll see us as not being strong. And so we have to fight fire with fire. We have to bring a gun to a gunfight, whatever the analogies are. But we just have to be honest. We have to be honest to amongst people of color. We have to be honest amongst, quite honestly, white folks, and just really try to be honest about what this is really about and say, look, if you really believe this country will move forward by oppressing more people and you think your economic status is going to improve, you're sadly mistaken. So, and let's not end this conversation without again mentioning we have tens of thousands of people wrongly, unjustly, criminally, inhumanely being incarcerated, if that's even the right word, on our southern border, unnecessarily, children being, we don't treat animals this way. And that's well documented. Thank you much for listening to the Found Translation podcast. If you like what you heard, continue to support the podcast, subscribe, share with your friends. You can always email me at podcastraise@gmail.com. That's podcastraise@gmail.com. Again, listen to the second half of the show where we get into a little more of a deep dive of what President Trump's comments over the last several days against the 4 women of color congresswomen who are true heroes, sheroes in our community, what it means, and a little bit more of our political punditry. Thank you so much. Check out the radio show, which will be live on Facebook if you're listening to this during the week of July 22nd. On Thursday evening, if you look me up, my Rafael Collazo name on Facebook. Well, my branding's really all over the place when I think about it. Live on Facebook, and then you'll hear it as a podcast. I'm going to have Kyle Darby from the Reform Alliance, one of the leading organizations around criminal justice reform, joining us, and we'll be joined by one of my very special co-hosts, part of our regular crew, Dionelli Reyes. History is being made. President Trump had some very shameful comments beginning over the weekend when he basically told 4 women of color who are members of Congress to go back where they came from, even though 3 are born in the United States and they're all U.S. citizens and only one's an immigrant. And doubled down on it last night with chants of center back directed at Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who's a Somali immigrant, been here since she was 12 years old and a citizen for, 20 years. I don't want to say we told you so, but you and I and our other cast members, other hosts have been talking about this even before the election of 2016, that this could usher in an era of, want to call it white nationalism, want to call it xenophobia, want to call it, but really from my political analysis is that the 2020 election is really going to be not a referendum of Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive. It's really a referendum of, do you want to move forward with an autocratic white nationalist state, or you want the democracy more or less as we normally would see it as? So this really leads to a very fundamental choice that we have next year.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think you said it. I think everyone kind of says it. I think what's amazing about this week's comment or discussion that's been going on is that I think for a lot of, especially I think a lot of professionals of color or people of color who are in leadership positions, they at some point have had a similar moment, right? When someone has wondered why they should be there, or what place do they come from, or should they go back in terms of where they came from, right? And even whether or not, you want to hear the latest remix that Trump is saying that, oh, well, we're talking about, basically an America love it or leave it kind of attitude. How many times have we also heard that as well, right? As people saying, look, I want to make a system better. Well, if you don't like it, why are you even here in the first place, right? Whether it's someone who's working at a job site and someone says, well, if you don't like this job, well, then, you just leave, right? That's never been an excuse for places. But I think it's a really important point where I think whether you're talking about Representative Liu, I think he penned a piece in the Washington Post that basically said the same thing that people have told him at different points of his life, or even in terms of different news feeds, folks have said, I've heard this argument before, kind of thrown at me. And so the thing is, a year out, right? I mean, if we were in the middle of a 2020 election, this would be a different conversation, but we're a year out, right? And so the real question is whether or not all this angst and all this anger, what does it do to people, right? What will it do to people? But I think it's a very clear indication, as you said, I mean, one of my good friends on Facebook, Sarita McFadden, who's a brilliant writer in her own right, she quoted this Atlantic article that I think that dropped either today or yesterday that Adric Serwerware wrote, and it was titled like "What Americans Do Now Will Define Us Forever." And he talks about this idea of like a multiracial democracy, right? And this is, it's not just white nationalism, but can people actually stand to have people of color and specifically Black and Latina women in positions of leadership that they disagree with, and can they handle that, right? And if we can't decide that we can do that, then the world is kind of messed up, because America was built on this idea of going, of bringing in different people and assimilating and integrating them. And if America as a nation can't deal with that, then you have to wonder whether or not that's, what's the recipe for the rest of the world in terms of a multiracial democracy? Because all these democracies have it, right? Whether it's in the Americas, or where you're talking about, this new Europe, where you have immigrants coming in and folding into the system. If a multiracial democracy can't really stand in America, then I don't know where else. I mean, I think there's serious questions of where else it can stand. So I think that's what we're talking about.
And we're seeing challenges not just in the United States, but in Latin America. Thinking about Brazil, where essentially, Brazil sort of followed the lead of the United States by electing a xenophobe, someone that's not particularly friendly towards the Black population, particularly the indigenous population, our wildlife. I mean, he's a disaster with the environmental stuff. And by the way, as a precursor, manipulated the justice system to throw his opponent, who was leading in the polls, the former President Lula, in prison. So there's a lot of issues there. I would say this, and then I want to get from a journalist perspective, Nicole, I'm going to put you on the spot with the political stuff, but I would say this, that, again, we've been saying this for quite some time. It's unfortunate, but they're now starting to say in the mainstream media, this is his only strategy. Anti-Semitic attacks against progressives around anti-Semitism, socialism, abortion, will be used as the red herrings when it is about race. And the unfortunate part is it's going to get worse in this country before it gets better, regardless of the outcome of that election next year. And people are going to get hurt. They're going to continue to get hurt, as we see from our people and children getting hurt on our southern border. Nicole, from a journalist perspective, I mean, this is really hard stuff to cover. I mean, this kind of extreme behavior, extreme rhetoric. I know you're in a very difficult position because you've got to report it as you see it, but at the same time, people are not drawing in the lines here. So, how as a Latina journalist trying to cover this, how's been? I mean, there's a lot of challenges in covering this rhetoric and this atmosphere at this point.
I mean, absolutely, and I mean it especially with these three reps, right? Because let's remember, right? This Congress elected like unprecedented amount of women of color into the House, right? So he's been targeting AOC, he's been targeting the other two women too, but he's very particular about who he targets and who he decides to call derogatory names and say stuff that it's not true and it's flat out offensive, right? So I mean, as a journalist, you see the pattern, right? Sometimes as a viewer, as an audience member, you see stories singled out, right? But as a journalist, you're in the newsroom every day, you're looking what to cover, and you see the patterns. And this is a pattern that, reflects the same rhetoric that he put out back in 2016, that he was just lashing at people from Mexico and Mexicans in this country. And I think that's the hardest part, how to convey that this is a pattern, right? That this is a tactic that he's used over and over, and make people understand that it's, we don't even know if, what, it's like, journalistically, it's also kind of hard because it has no basis on anything, it's like, he just like spits out whatever thing, like for example, he did it today when he responded to Puerto Rico. He keeps insisting that Puerto Rico got 92 billion in aid, and that's not true. That number is closer to how much is estimated Puerto Rico can get in the next 2 decades, 20 years.
Exactly.
So it's like this narrative of I'm just gonna say whatever, and if people like it, they're just gonna rally behind me. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And other leaders, like you were saying, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, other people in other countries are kind of picking up on these practices. You see in Philippines, Duterte also doing really scandalous remarks and follow up with policies. It seems like, they're like, well, if it worked for Trump, maybe it works in other parts of the world.
Well, and we've even seen that in the Indian elections, where xenophobia and religious rivalries have surfaced as part of their dynamic. Nicole, I'm really curious in terms of what conversations have had in newsrooms that you've heard and talked to other journalists around how these 4 women of Congress who were duly elected and, have as much right to be respected as honorable members of Congress as anyone else. In terms of this use of terminology of the squad, how they're referred to as the squad, obviously that's lingo that we use in the street and kind of when we code switch. I think it's something that they refer to themselves sort of affectionately about, but there has been conversations around, are we sort of buying into sort of not giving them the proper respect or sort of using that kind of colloquial terminology? Has that been how they've been referred to as a group, those 4 women of Congress? What's been the conversations like around how to cover them and properly sort of give them their respect?
I mean, specifically on this issue, I actually don't know if that using that term became like a big conversation or they just ran with what was said. But I mean, I think it's a good question that you bring, because in this instance or in any other instances in the past or moving forward, I don't think those conversations happen enough, right? We see the same thing happening when well, should we call this racist? Can we say that Trump made racist remarks? You know, I think that when he was elected president, like newsrooms, a lot of newsrooms didn't necessarily feel confident in how to handle those things and how to call things. And, you know, are we being too objective by calling it racist, or are we being objective? And I think more of those types of conversations like we had with labeling something racist or not need to happen every single time, especially if this president is running for the re-election, because this is, you know, we already had a round 2016. We should have won a thing or two this time around, right?
That's
so
right.
Specifically for the squad, I don't know. I was on Puerto Rico mode, and I don't know if it became a big deal. But overall, it does, like, those kinds of conversations need to happen. Like, you can just not just flat out use the language that the president or anybody being problematic, racist, offensive comments is using, you know, without having those conversations.
We also need to start with, in my opinion, with the Speaker of the House, who sort of fomented the House leadership, sort of fomented this internal rivalry, which sort of led to sort of Trump trying to take advantage of it. Madeline Villanueva, always helpful in the chat, says that she shared a video that Ayanna Presley is owning the squad. They're very comfortable using that terminology. She also challenges the fact that America's always had these racial challenges, obviously from our beginnings, right, with slavery, and women not being allowed the right to vote. So no, those are very, very good points, Madeline. The other thing I wanted to touch on is our Stacking 20 segment. I shared with you before we started taping, Nicole, that we always try to throw a little bit in of conversation about the elections. I don't know if LB's available, but LB, one thing that's interesting is that we've got but LB pops up, is that, you know, it's funny because when I said on the show, Vanessa's having some issues, connectivity. Well, just chat us your comments, Vanessa, because we only have a few more minutes. When I said on the show, I think I said on Facebook, they should have had the draw for the debates on TV, like March Madness style, had representatives from the campaigns, made it fun. And then some people thought I was being silly and trying to tease me about it. Well, guess what, LB? Guess what CNN decided to do next Thursday? They're doing the draw.
They're doing the draw because they know.
It's fun. It's fun. And it's critical. And this is my little tidbit. Biden better light a couple candles that he don't get Warren on this one, because she will cook him on the Becking Reg stuff. And who knows the combinations that could happen. I think Julian definitely wants a shot at Biden too. To sort of be one of the champions and really challenge not only that generational argument, but also establish himself along with a Kamala as one of the true, real civil rights candidates in this race.
Yeah.
And I think Biden's really crossing his fingers he don't get Warren. LB, what are you thinking about when it comes to the draw next week? What are the combinations and possibilities you're looking at?
Well, I definitely agree. I think the other thing I think we're looking at seeing is that we're talking about Detroit, we're talking about urban America, we're talking about housing, we're talking about those kind of issues there. And I think in that way, it should lead to Julian's, strength, right? I mean, if the former head of HUD can't talk about housing, then he might as well just go home, right? I mean, for all
and let's bring housing into the conversation, not to just diminish, your colleagues, Nicole, because I know it was an NBC event, but and look, it's only 2 hours, it's not perfect, but even though we were in Miami, no conversation about Puerto Rico, no conversation, very little about Latin America.
I called it out. I mean, that's what happened, and that's my job as a journalist. It doesn't matter. It's the news organization I work for. They were in Miami, and with the whole current situation in Puerto Rico, not specifically with the protests because that came later, but overall with the hurricane aid and the fact that Florida is one of the states that felt the most the impact of Hurricane Maria and the pain that Puerto Ricans were grappling with, right? And Venezuelans, for example, a lot of Venezuelans have fled Miami.
Cuban policy. I mean, there's a
Cuban
lot of issues.
Nothing you had. It was, I agree 100%, and these are powerful voting blacks that need to be taken into account.
And I think if someone's really smart, and I think the candidates have an opportunity here to tie up a couple of things in non-quote unquote stereotypical ways, right? And so I think, for example, you can talk about Detroit. There's a lot of comparisons you can make between Detroit and Puerto Rico in terms of the junta and strategy there, and in terms of what do you do to a place to revitalize, right? There's a lot of discussion in Detroit about entrepreneurship, about rebuilding housing stock and doing those things. That is not just for any other place in America, but that's also Puerto Rico, right? That's also things that Latinos do. And so I think the candidate who is able to do that without seeming like they're pandering, well, again, will take a leap forward in terms of people's minds.
I'm glad you brought this up, LB. And with my day job at Unidos US, I travel the country having forums with Latino leaders and community members. And let me tell you something. When it comes to whether it's sort of the rent's too high or access to mortgages for home ownership or gentrification, housing is a big issue in the Latino community. And it's even more fundamental than sort of like the obvious. I mean, LA is homelessness. There's homelessness that's impacting our community, and Latinos, we don't think of, that's an issue we don't discuss enough about how it manifests in our community. But there's something more fundamental I want people to share with us. Little Havana, Western San Antonio. I'll be in Las Vegas next week. Eastern side of Houston / Pasadena, Texas. The fundamental cultural dynamic is that because some of these neighborhoods are getting hipsterfied and gentrified, is that Latinos are feeling this sense of loss because we're losing control, we're losing access to housing in our traditional communities. These have been Latino neighborhoods decades, 100+ years in the case of places like Texas. So there's something going on in our culture and in our communities that I think is even more fundamental than the statistical reality. Housing's a big issue. Thank you all for bringing that up. I want to give people a few tidbits, and we're going to start wrapping this up. In terms of the conversations I was having in D.C. this week, this Biden strategy around running his Rose Garden campaign, I don't think is a good one. I mean, this guy, he's pushing, but I'll get into the details of how I heard this, but he tries to schedule all of this presidential stuff around family stuff. Like grandkids' birthdays. And it's a very I don't want to say casual, but almost like casual, I'm above it all kind of campaign. And that to me is not going to be a recipe for success. And again, I go back to when he gets in that debates, especially if Warren can get him on the financial stuff, in contrast to Kamala on the civil rights, I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And I'm not surprised he's slipping in the polls. I think we're starting to see people starting to understand that Warren and Harris in particular are looking very strong. The last thing is that in terms of Iowa, because thinking about, we could say everything we want about the national polls, but really so much is going to be determined on who finishes in the top 2 to 4 in Iowa. From what I'm hearing is that Warren and even Booker have the top field campaigns on the ground in Iowa. And I'm hearing Sanders' campaign is not as strong as I would have assumed it would be, considering because of his background, because of the fact that he did very well in Iowa in 2016, and he's sort of doing a redo. So just some little tidbits I'm throwing out there. These are things I hear when I talk to our leaders around the country. And again, I think on some level, we've said it before. I think at this point, and we'll talk about it next week on the show, LB, I am formulating a theory very strong. While I don't think Bernie Sanders is going to win this election, I don't believe that. He's got a little bit of a shot, but I think he will be the difference maker in this election, because at the end of the day, the election, I think, in my opinion, is going to come down to if and when he's able to exit, if he's still in the 4th or 5th spot, to throw a support behind Harris and Warren, that could tip the elections.
I'm going to throw you a sports analogy here. I think that Bernie in many ways is the Kevin Durant of the Democratic field, right? Because he is the one person that is that all the other signings, all the other things is going to revolve around, right? Now, whether or not he's got, he's injured or not is your perspective. It's not like
yeah.
But everything else falls in line, right? Or falls in whether policy wise, whether or not who's
he's won the argument. He's a victim of his own success because he's won the policy argument.
Yeah. So, but the question will be how his policy again. again, I think, we can have a separate discussion about strategy and what the GOP is doing, especially, I saw the latest attack ads that they've been trying to do that basically said, the squad equals anarchy, right? So, anything that they're arriving up to do it. So, we'll see whether or not the policy argument, him winning the policy argument is an actual victory for Democrats or not. But I do think that I would agree. I think he holds a huge sway. I don't know. I still tend to think that we still haven't seen that moment for him, whether or not, he's playing, he's par for the course. He's in the field, and, we just have to figure, he's got to figure it out.
Hey, and our Montana governor, Steve Bullock, is going to get a shot. So now this wall rolls out. Anyway, we'll see. Hopefully they'll ask the gang a question, LB, this time. Well, they could ask the poor man a question. Anyway, as we wrap this up, wanted to give a quick, this episode was dedicated, first of all, to these people that are, and especially these children, they're being tortured on our southern border. I don't mince words. So we got to love and respect our prayers for those children, those families. Eric Gardner, we lost that brother, 5 years ago, LB? 5 years ago, for selling Lucy's. And our attorney general, despite his own department's recommendation, is not gonna proceed with charges against Pantaleo. And Hector Figueroa, celebrated Latino labor leader, the president of SEIU 32BJ out of New York, passed away suddenly last week. What a wonderful man. He was a mentor of so many of our friends, Natalia Salgado, Lucia Gomez. I could just go down the list of people, particularly in New York, that he mentored and supported. So we want to give our love, and a Puerto Rican as well. Healthcare, the fight for living wage for the Newark airport workers, who we've collaborated with a ton on over the years. So just descanse en paz, Hector Figueroa. Thank you. And Vanessa Rivera chimes in. These are my parting words regarding Puerto Rico. The levee finally broke and the days of benditos are done with. Wow, good way to put it, Vanessa. Thank you all so much. Nicole, fantastic. Love to have you back when you get a moment. I know you're very busy. And thank you, Albie, of course, for producing the show. Thank you again for watching and listening to the Found in Translation talk show, and have a wonderful evening.